OpenSSF is going to have an OpenSSF day coincident with or co-located with the Open Source Summit in Vancouver in May. It has not been announced yet, but it was soft announced yesterday in the TAC call. So
oh, cool.
There should be a CFP for that. I don't know whether or not it will be focused on only OpenSSF projects, but it's worth us tossing a paper in. Oh, and the DEF CON CFP just opened.
Ooh.
So
I'm going to add that to the upcoming events.
Yeah. So for folks who've gone to DEF CON regularly, if you think of a village that would be a good match for this kind of content, rather than the main stage, it's also a good thing to note. I think I'm better connected to policy and crypto privacy villages, and I know there's a ton of different villages. I'm not sure which one would be the best fit for OmniBOR. Any other comments on conferences or blog posts or social media? If not, let's jump into the Spec.
Usenet.
Go ahead, Balaji.
Summer deadline, right? The summer deadline is June 7th, I think, or something, first week of June.
For which
summer?
For we missed the, sorry, we missed the winter deadline, right? The next, yeah.
There are a lot of different Usenet conferences. So, Balaji, do you know which?
Oh, the Usenet security is what we were planning, right? The one we missed on Feb 7th.
Yep.
Yeah, the next one for that is I believe it's June, right? They had fall, summer, and winter deadlines. So the summer deadline is June 7th. Hopefully, we'll have more strong submission for the summer.
Got it. Thank you. I didn't realize that was more than once a year.
Yeah.
Great.
Cool. I think since Chris is not here, we should probably skip the blog post bit.
Yeah.
Bless you.
Excuse me. Thank you. Yeah, this cough is just going to hang around for a while.
Yeah, I hope yours resolves faster than mine. When I had COVID, the stupid cough hung around for 6 months afterwards.
Well, here I am almost 3 years later, still coughing.
I resemble those statements.
Ed, do you have the brain to dive in and lead some of the Spec discussions? Since
there's only one way to know.
Or does someone else have one of these? Since I don't have the brain right now to.
Well, some of them I actually made some headway with this morning, and some of them I very much apologize. I did not, but I did capture them here. So we had restoring the Annex B bit, which everyone generally agreed was a good idea, but had lots of very productive nits to pick on. In particular, fixing the size of the field, the padding of the field, and then adding some spec information to link in. And then I think the other nits, and by the way, I cannot begin to explain how much I appreciate copy editing nits like this because I'm terrible at it. And so it's super helpful to me.
Okay, glad to be of service.
Sometimes people who pick nits at this level feel like they're annoying people. It's exactly the opposite with me. Fixed that. I think I fixed most of these. there was this conversation about whether or not to have Gitoid be lowercase.
Yeah, and I'll say for that, it's not like a strong feeling of one way or the other. It's more just like, having a consistent choice for how we're doing it.
And OID, DID, any of these, they're also acronyms.
True. My tendency, the reason I had it lowercase, and please don't let this be strictly binding, is because in the URIs, it's lowercase. And I feel strongly about lowercase for the URIs because
Right.
capitalization in schemes feels like a bad anti-pattern. But that was sort of the reason I was following this pattern here. I think in the documentation, the website and so forth, it's been Gitoid, consistently lowercase. I will tell you, however, that in the Go code, I do exactly the same thing you do in Rust code, because it kind of wants to do that in the way that you camel case traditionally in Go.
Yeah.
So I that is still sort of out there. And then we had this question you'd raised, Andrew, about consistency. Do you want to say a little more about this?
Sure. And also I just put a little comment that actually in Rust, when you have an acronym, you only capitalize the first letter of the acronym. So it's Gitoid with just the O capitalized, but the IND lowercase. So that's just a funny inconsistency, but it's like the standard Rust practice. So, okay, so here, this was just about, I've been sort of going again through the spec in the last couple of days, in part because for the Rust implementation, it's kind of wrapped up a lot of the main stuff for the Gitoid crate. So moving more into, fixing up the implementation for the OmniBOR crate. And it seems like there are a few different terms that get used in different places for, the thing that identifies the artifact. In some places, it's described or referenced as the Gitoid. In some places, it's called the OmniBOR identifier. And then here it's artifact dependency graph identifier. And what I don't want is people to read it and then think that those are that there are distinct things that are being discussed here, and then wondering, oh, what's this identifier? Is that the same as this other one? It's all, we do a hash of the thing, and then that's the identifier, along with whatever kind of object it is, and all of that. But just wanting to be consistent in the term that we use.
I made a bunch of comments on the main body of the spec, and I also felt there was a fair amount of inconsistency in the terminology around identifiers. But I do think there is a sort of split here. Like there's the Git OIDs, which are the sort of like low-level mechanism for making identifiers, and then there's the different purposes to which we put Git OIDs in the spec. And so it should be like, we should be consistent about making sure that we define, give a name to each of these special purposes and define them as saying these are represented as Git OIDs, but in this context, it is a whatever identifier.
Yeah, that seems reasonable to me.
Yeah, and I apologize. This speaks to the level of hypoxia I'm dealing with right now. I completely missed the fact that you're really commenting on was artifact graph identifier being in there, which clearly should be made more consistent. The way I've tended to conceptualize this is very similar to what Jeremy has, which is I think about it as the role of the thing and then the identifier of the thing that we're talking about, right? So, essentially what it is and then how we identify it. And Gitoid is how we identify it. But yeah, some working out a consistency of the language, I think, is probably a good idea. If folks have suggestions as to the way the language could be made more consistent, that would be super welcome.
Yeah. And there is a distinction that has been nagging at my brain for a while, that perhaps we can work into this. The differentiation between here's how we identify a thing and here's the nature of the thing we're identifying, right? All binary objects can be identified with a hash, given a consistent hash function that is unique. Some binary artifacts are themselves just an artifact of an output of a build. Some of them are an artifact dependency graph. that graph has the semantic value. Its hash also functions as an identifier of the object.
Mhm.
And this is a concept that is really key to what we're building here, but also really lost on a lot of folks.
So at the risk of channeling my inner Jeremy, the identifier for the graph is an identifier for the inputs for the object. It is possible to have multiple output objects that are distinct from the same set of inputs.
That's exactly where I'm going. And it is possible to have multiple outputs that are exactly the same from different inputs if you don't embed the graph.
Right.
Yeah, if you don't have embedding, which is,
Yeah,
I think moving down to another chunk of the conversation.
I'm not trying to go there, but the conceptual difference, I think we need, as we're tightening up the terminology here, what's really important to convey to the reader of the spec is that we have two conceptual entities. We have artifacts and we have artifact dependency graphs. Both have, both can be identified with a hash function. And the hash of the dependency graph can be used some of the time as an identifier for the binary, but it isn't. This is the tricky part. And this is where people get stuck understanding what we're describing. And I think we're tripping over the nature of embedding. So clarifying our terminology here might help us get there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think effectively, yeah, I think that's all correct. Apologies, I'm just a little bit dim today.
I'm not sure I know what the right terms are yet. So if folks have suggestions, toss them up there. Otherwise, I will try to find the brain power later today to take a pass at this.
That would be most welcome. And I think in general, this is something that's actually plagued other places. So the SPDX folks have put external identifiers in for gitoids in support of us. But what they don't actually have there as cleanly is the nature of part that you were referencing, right? Because it could be the gitoid of the artifact itself. It could be the gitoid of the artifact dependency graph for the artifact, or the OmniBOR for the artifact, however we choose to call it. Yeah, apologies,
Yeah.
I'm running out of steam.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the point that resonates with me that Dave is making is that, like, we have the Git ID of, say, a binary itself, and assuming that binary has an OmniBOR document embedded in it, we also have a separate ID for that document on its own. And we currently don't have any mechanism to connect those two aside from the embedding.
Right. Related to this, and I haven't opened an issue for this yet, but it's something I've been thinking about. Given that the record of everything can, like, all the inputs can be recorded in either an embedding, or they can be put into a separate file, I think calling it an OmniBOR document, which is what the spec currently does, might be maybe not the best name, because it, to me at least, sort of implies or like suggests more of having a distinct thing rather than in the embedding case. I'm wondering if like OmniBOR record or some other term might sort of avoid that implication.
Yeah, I go ahead, Jeremy.
So, I mean, this is I have a thing in mind that I've been thinking about, and I really don't want to get into it right now because it'll be huge digression if we do. But I've been thinking about additional kinds of OmniBOR documents, like different OmniBOR owned data structures. And so if we call this thing the OmniBOR document, then that's going to become confusing if we introduce any other document like things. So I personally think of it as like an OmniBOR manifest, because it's not
manifest is a good word.
It's not strictly that, but it's closer. I mean, it's evocative. And the thing I've been thinking about is adding an extra field onto each line of the manifest, if we could call it that, to describe the role or purpose of that input of that line, where that is itself a Git OID of a structured document that might say like, this is a tool chain, or this is a source file input, or something like that.
That's interesting.
So it's just embedding more taxonomic data.
Yeah, per your suggestion, I don't want to go off into that right now. But that's an interesting potential digression. I will say that I have been slightly uncomfortable when we switched over to calling these OmniBOR identifiers and OmniBOR documents. It was mostly a copy pasta over the use of GitBomb. I've been slightly uncomfortable with that for many of the reasons that folks have actually laid out here, in that it's probably useful to have other kinds of, to have a more descriptive name that doesn't just stamp the word OmniBOR on it.
Yeah. I think so. Certain things are still Gitoids. That didn't change and shouldn't change. I am partial to artifact dependency graph identifier because it is descriptive and accurate.
Yeah.
So another thing this will help is on the implementation side, when we want to compare versions, different implementations, especially across languages, having that consistency in names will help tremendously, and will also help facilitate an eventual creation of a set of tests where the names align and you're not having to parse between different terminology that is used inconsistently. So I think trying to get something that's a little bit more tightly scoped on what we mean, and there will be overlap. Like when we say like we have a Gitoid is technically a hash, and we have other uses of hashes and so on. But so there will be overlap in that scenario. But I think if we develop a sense of being exact in our words and develop a better set of terminology to fit here, we'll go a tremendous way towards helping not only people understand Spec.
The one thing I want to sort of throw out there, and keep in mind, I'm not getting enough oxygen to my brain right now, so don't take me too seriously, is there's a little something rolling around in my head. Jeremy, you're in the habit of talking about these as the inputs. And something about that feels compelling to me. And I don't know what to do with that feeling right now, probably because I'm not getting enough oxygen to the brain right now. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
If they're not inputs, then what are they? Sorry, I mean, like
my point is, as we're naming things, right? So we just had a vote for artifact dependency graph being the compelling name here, an artifact dependency graph identifier. And I'm perfectly okay if that's where we want to go. But I've often found your consistent characterization of them as inputs to be both simple and compelling. Does that make sense? I think you think I was disagreeing with the use of the term inputs. And what I'm saying is something about inputs feels compelling to me, and maybe we should think about that as we're naming the thing.
Yeah, I'm hearing violent agreement is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think I'm using the word dependency much in a very similar way to Jeremy's use of input. I think.
Yep.
Jeremy, does that resonate with you?
So the distinction I'm drawing here is input is the immediate input. It's the thing that we're directly using. And then dependencies to me tends to imply the transitive graph that comes off.
That's a very fair point. You're right. And I the graph that I have in mind is in fact the first order dependencies only, because each of those contains or could contain the transitive dependency at the next tier. So yeah, artifact input graph.
Right.
It has the awkwardness of being AIGI.
Well, so I mean, graph is redundant. Like either it's the transitive dependencies or it's the first order input. I think adding graph in there kind of confuses what you're talking about. This is a slight digression, but one of the comments I made on the main body of the spec is perhaps clarifying the way that there isn't the graph. Like there is a graph for any specific artifact, but the overall graph is a composition of subgraphs as well.
Right.
And so like any subgraph, like any identifier for any artifact within the graph is itself a complete graph.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things that jump out at me, and I dropped a comment here, which is we've sort of drawn the distinction that we're being fuzzy in many places, conflating the document which contains the immediate inputs for this artifact with the full graph, or as Mark suggested, transitive dependency closure, or whatever we want to call it there. And I think whatever names we choose, we probably don't want to be conflating those two. Does that make sense?
They're very distinct. And,
Yeah.
and this is actually a pattern that I've noticed a few times in the spec. For example, like this is totally different domain, but the spec uses build tool as a synonym for the act of performing the build, a build action. And
Okay.
I feel that those should be clearly separated concepts as well. Obviously closely related, but they're not the same thing.
So,
Okay.
a recommendation as well here is that perhaps we should set up some type of a Google slide or set of slides. And what we do is we put the structure of OmniBOR down, and we go and describe what we mean for each particular item. So like when we say a dependency graph, or we say, what do we mean by input, or what do we mean by, just to help with the terminology and helping us get in sync with what's exact. Because what I worry about is that even with being more exact, we may still have differences in what we're discussing or how we're visualizing things.
I mean, I think all of this, like the definition section of the spec should define all the terms that we're using, and then we should just make sure the rest of the spec uses those terms in very consistent ways.
Well, I agree, but the thing that I worry about is that a lot of people are not in the habit of reading specs, and having something that helps somebody get into the conversation at a later time, that something like this would still help.
Having a ASCII diagram at the beginning of the spec to help ground the description of each of the labels or terms we're going to use in a visual representation, I think that's perfectly appropriate to do.
Yep.
OmniBOR orientation slides.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is that we working on the spec are not consistent and not sufficiently clear, and so that's the prerequisite for having any kind of like more easily consumable.
I'm in violent agreement with Jeremy that we've conflated a lot of terms, and I'm as much at fault for that as anybody, with words like build tool, anything that does a build related thing, very not specific of me and not in character. But there's a distinction, there's a couple distinctions here that we've touched on the past 15 minutes or so that I think would benefit from visual representations, both of the artifacts we have and we generate examples we have, and the logical flow, to really make clear the distinction between an identifier as a hash, a manifest of identifiers, and the logical result that is the hash of the manifest of hashes, and how we compose a tree. If we look at the demos that folks have given over the past several months, when you're building a deeper graph, more than just the hello world, the deep graph is the logical sum of a whole lot of depth equals 1 lists or manifests. But a single file isn't that whole thing. Or rather, as far as I can recall, and Nell or Bharati, please correct me if I'm wrong in remembering your demos, there is not generated a single file that contains the actual tree structure of the whole depth of a deeper build, but that graph is represented on disk, spread across many files, with references to each other. I guess my point is that no file contains the artifact dependency graph, but the directory does.
Not necessarily even.
Right.
It could be distributed across multiple machines.
In the examples, Jeremy, I agree. I'm just talking about the examples we've seen.
Sure. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. So really quickly, I would
so
suggest that in interest of time, there is another spicy conversation that we should probably launch into, and that's the OmniBOR what to do
Yeah.
in the absence of OmniBOR dir.
I
And this
wanna-
conversation was raised at a time when you weren't here, Eva. And since you have feelings
Okay.
about this, we didn't want to come to any conclusions.
Thank you.
In
I would
your
like to
absence.
wrap up with the point I was just making.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Since no one said that my recollection there is wrong, I'm going to go out on a spicy take here and say that using the term artifact dependency graph to describe any single logical object, at least as we've described everything so far, is inaccurate, because no file contains the graph. Every file contains a manifest. Together, they create a graph.
Yeah.
Yep. Totally on
Okay.
board with it.
Cool. Given that, let's move on.
Cool.
Awesome.
All right. So there's this proposal to only generate OmniBOR when the OmniBOR dir is specified. This sort of, in addition to highlighting the problem we have with terminology we need to resolve, effectively, this comes down to simply saying, if you don't tell me to create OmniBOR information, and you don't tell me to go write it in the file system somewhere, please note this is actually part of Annex A, so it's talking exclusively about what to do when you're creating, where to put these things and so forth on a file system. Effectively, it's a relatively simple change, and I know you had some comments on it as well, Jeremy. But do folks have thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are there, but I did also have the adjunct thing of like, should we consider renaming the ADG directory as well? Because like that's a minor thing comparing.
I think the actual proposal here is to not have a default, because we're only putting them someplace when you tell us where to put them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that if we don't propose a default, like if we let people choose freely, then we'll end up with a great big mess. I think it's useful to, like, even if it's not necessarily the spec,
in GCC and in Clang, in LD and GNU LD and LLD as well, the default is where the object file is created. So if you create an object file food auto in some directory, the default option is to create this OmniBOR document, what we call so far. That is also created in the same place. So that has been the default that we have used for GCC and Clang implementations.
Yeah, my concern with that was that it kind of assumes that all of the object files are written into the same directory in order to convert them in that same place.
Not necessarily, because at least in our usage, we've seen a lot of cases where you have a -o and you channel them to different related directories. So they are all not, well, in a very naive implementation, I guess you compile everything in one directory,
Yeah.
but even in Linux or in OpenSSL builds, we have seen that the objects are created in different subdirectories based on what it belongs to.
This is part of why I had taken out the option 3 here of a default.adg, where directory to which we're writing out the artifact, is that you wind up with a scatter gather problem, right? So basically you have .o files all over the place, and now you have all these .adgs all over the place as well. And that's probably not what you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think
my early assumption with .adg was that it would be at the root of whatever the project folder is, a build folder, much like parallel to .git today.
That gets really complicated really fast.
I
when
realize
you look at the way people play games with the cursive make.
Yep.
I mean, in principle, like you could have a single machine-wide or organization-wide, .adg directory, and so.
Or you could have a project-wide, and the only way to set that is through the OmniBOR dir variable.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, given that there's like we get the most benefits by the more things writing into the same place as possible. So we want to like have a proposal which tends towards doing that. And obviously people are not generally going to have like a $home.adg or something like that, but project wide would make sense.
Yeah. So
So,
the
Mark-
issue here, I don't think, is where we put it so much as whether to default to outputting this information, right?
Yeah, and I think we can't default to outputting it without having explicit configuration because there's no way of getting the place right enough.
And that's kind of the point of what I had here.
Yeah.
Is if you don't give me some so first of all, if you don't give me some indication that you want OmniBOR like things done, I shouldn't be doing them. And that if you don't tell me where to put them, I shouldn't be doing OmniBOR related stuff for you because I don't know where to put the stuff.
And this,
Yeah, this is also really important when you talk about how to get consistency across things, because if we put something that looks like a default, people may shove it in and override things that are higher in terms of not the build tool but the orchestrator themselves. And one really good example as well is if you start to look at how a lot of build systems work, and there was a great point about the root being unwritable, but there's also a scenario where you may have different locations where you stick your artifacts. So you'll have the actual build artifacts go out towards one directory, and the person may specify a different output for OmniBOR that's completely unrelated to that actually gets slurped up by the infrastructure and then handled in a separate path or a separate pipeline.
Yeah.
So I think we need to be really careful in terms of default, because the worst case scenario is people end up putting defaults in which end up overriding the intended behavior of a tool that's way higher up the chain.
I will also add that defaulting to not outputting this violates the sort of first principle I have with OmniBOR of make this, the end result should require zero effort from the average developer.
So the one thing I'll say to that, and this is something that sort of got clear in my mind when I was looking at the numbers for, pardon me, the numbers for the kernel stuff with LLVM Clang, and it didn't really slow things down a lot. If I remember correctly, and Bharatha, keep me honest here, it was like 4 to 6% slowdown, which turned into a couple minutes for the kernel. But it
That's right.
output a fairly large, I want to say north of a gig worth of OmniBOR documents, which compared to everything else the kernel is writing out is not a huge deal. Like as a relative thing, it's not a huge deal, but it is a fairly large shift in the output of the thing when you didn't ask for it. And there's a whole lot of use cases where we can short circuit certain kinds of conversations just by saying, okay, if you don't want it, don't turn it on. So for example, a bunch of the conversations around the sort of weak reproducible build stuff, you could just say, look, if you don't want it, don't turn it on. And then if one of your downstream consumers says, hey, look, I really need this, well, then you may need to move towards strong reproducible builds.
Remind me, is this a write-only directory, or are things also trying to read from this?
Keep me honest here, Bharathi and Vajislav, but I think it's essentially a write-only directory because you're reading the identifiers from the artifacts themselves, if they're present, and then using those to construct the OmniBOR document and then go write it out.
Starts out as a write-only directory, you're going to have to kind of commit to that because people and build pipelines are going to start depending on that.
I'm sorry, pipelines, I didn't quite hear you.
If you start out with it being write-only, you're probably going to have to commit to that forever because build pipelines will start depending on it being a write-only directory.
Well, and also write-only is always relative to something. Right. So I think we all expect that there will be something downstream that reads from the directory.
Oh, yes, but the build process may not. The build process may be enjoined from reading from it.
I would say that unless we have a reason to enjoin the build process from reading from it, that we may not want to over constrain the system prematurely.
The
But
problem is that it's going to get over constrained. People will start depending on it being never read from.
Well, so let's back up for a second. If in fact, can you give me some specific examples of the kinds of problems that you're thinking of?
Well, I mean, the reason I asked was, like, obviously the first question is that if it's ever being read from, then you have to know where to read it from. And so if you're writing this at some, like, you have to know where to read from as well as where to write to. And in particular, if you've got like using artifacts from different directories and each directory has its own .adg, then what? And the second is the more pragmatic, like practical thing of like, if you have things concurrently writing to the same directory, then how do you make sure they don't stomp on each other? And if you have things both reading and writing from that directory, how do you make sure that what you're reading is not currently being half written? And you know, how do you make sure you're reading concrete stuff?
Yeah, good.
Well, and thirdly is how do you make sure that directory is correct? Because if you've got a distributed build system or something like that, then no one build node is going to see the entirety of everything anyway. So it's okay if it's purely writing stuff out and then you have some post-build process that aggregates all those directories together into one place. But if you also require reading it at build time, then that might require like cross build node communication or something like that.
Okay, now this makes more sense. You're worried about the
and so
racing
here's a situation where reading it could be required. I think, check me on this. If some tools in a build pipeline support outputting OmniBOR docs and some do not, even though it's enabled globally, some tools just haven't been updated. That's a realistic scenario people will encounter. In that case, can the next tool in the chain combine the inputs when some inputs contained OmniBOR docs and some did not? Can it construct the necessary outputs by only reading the inputs with no access to OmniBOR dir?
Well, so basically, I think traditionally what we've said is that if you do not have some indication, traditionally by embedding of the identifier in the artifact of the inputs for a given artifact, that you treat that artifact as a leaf in the graph because you can't know anything else.
I realize that, but if you have a gap, if tools in a particular line up that tree, if the first and second tools embedded an OmniBOR ID, the third tool did not, and the fourth tool is able to, you just treat that as a leaf and truncate it right there? Or is there a way to...
I don't know if we can do any better than that.
Okay.
Honestly.
Yeah, I think for a concrete example, we could probably use Ccache as a example that is publicly available. As in the build, if the tool itself does not support OmniBOR directly, but we still generate something in that scenario, and then like how will we handle that with a system like Ccache, where that dependency still gets transferred around, but there's no traversal of that information, of the OmniBOR information that would be useful. And so I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, I think TPP's had his hand up for some time.
Oh, thank you. I didn't see it.
So no worries. People often ignore me. I'm so ignorable. So I think in terms of overwriting, I don't think we should have any concerns about that at all, because the file names themselves are the gitoid of the thing that's being written. So given that, I can't see any collision where you have two writers that are writing exactly the same thing, because the results are going to be exactly the same write. I also don't see a concurrent writing and reading phase. I agree that there might be reading after the writing has been completed, but I don't see reading while some other tools are doing writing. And once again, I may be myopic on that one, but I have, lower concerns about kind of the stale read problem for simultaneous reading and writing. Does that analysis make sense in the scope of the conversation that we just had, or did I miss something?
I mean, technically, if you writes are not necessarily atomic. So if you have two things that are overwriting each other, there's all sorts of possible failure modes where the result, like even if they're writing exactly the same bytes, the resulting file is mangled in some way. And with the read after write, if you have a tool that's writing its output and then it exits, and that's the signal saying I've written all my outputs, and it writes the OmniBOR documents, like the artifact graph objects, before it exits, then I think you're right. But you could easily imagine someone sort of saying, oh, this document's auxiliary and it's not critical, so I can like signal that my primary output has been written and then go and asynchronously write my document after signaling that my output has been written. And then if someone comes along and reads it, they might read it in the middle of that. So there's a sort of like implied guarantee here that if you want to have read after write, then you have to sort of assert that tools must complete writing those documents before they signal that their sort of primary artifact has been generated.
Well, there are a couple of other, I mean, when you really get into thorny situations, and then the reason these don't occur to most people is that most builds don't produce these, but there are definitely builds that do. They get to be highly parallel. When you get into thorny situations, for example, typically speaking, when I want to create a new file for something, I'll go open it, truncate, right? Trunk, which means I could have a scenario for a very brief moment in time where I haven't written to the file, but the file's been truncated. And so the file could have the hash for what it should have, but you were going to say something, Ava?
Yeah, we are. I'm going to wrap up the
Full time?
conversation because we're almost out of time.
All right, so let me just jump in to respond to Jeremy's comment. I think then in the spec, we need to have clear write boundaries, which is normal in the JVM. The JVM has a memory model. We should basically have a persistence model where there are well-defined boundaries of when things can be parallel, when things need to be serial, and signals sent to move to the next phase.
I
I
wonder deeply how whether we have gone so far into trying to define what build tools do when everything across different languages and different types of build tools will necessarily behave in its own ways, right? We're trying to create a little bit of consistency across build tools here by describing, if you're going to write to a file system, here's where you should do it, or here's the environment variable you should read, but not enforce it. We can't enforce it.
I'm also uncomfortable with that being in the spec. Like, how do we synchronize? When do we synchronize, etc.? Is to me feels like it clearly belongs in the implementation, and we can call out certain edge cases to say if you has an implementation note in an appendix, if you are implementing, here are some considerations that you may want to be aware of.
An important one to tease out of this is noting that individual build tools should, and we could even say should treat the whatever directory they're writing to as though it is write only, right? This is not saying it must be, but if you're going to write to the file system, you should treat that directory as write only. That solves some of these issues, but it's gone quite in the weeds from should we have an environment variable to how should the file system interactions occur.
So fundamentally, my view on this is that we shouldn't be talking about directory writing at all, except as a, I mean, I guess Annex A file system storage is fine, but we should, like in the spec, define an abstract model for this. Also, I'm actually confused as to what this directory is for at all. Like, do we need to write it? If every document is already embedded in an artifact, then...
Well, we're not embedding the documents in the artifacts. We're embedding the identifiers of the documents in the artifacts.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, the artifact, the header we're embedding in the artifacts is a fixed size, and it's just the identifier of the document.
I see.
There's also scenarios where the output may be constrained in such a way that you cannot reasonably stick anything in it without breaking something. So we need to be sensitive to that. Like if the output is, I have a file here that's going to have a SQL statement or something like that. Still a valid
So,
output.
folks, we are at time. We're about to go over time. I want to thank you all for the discussion, and I think we have a separate issue. We didn't resolve the, do we have a default directory, a default value of the OmniBOR dir variable? We now have another issue. Who'd like to open an issue to track it?
Probably someone who could articulate what the
I
issue
can do
is.
it. I can do it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you all next week. Bye, folks.
Take care.